there is no salvation.
Hey everybody, welcome to Raw Fury Special Developer Edition of the Anders and Jonas Show. I'll let these guys introduce themselves and then we'll talk a little bit about games development, role-playing games, indie games, and whatever else comes up in this Scandinavian power time.
Yeah.
Introduce yourself, my friend.
My name is Anders Lauritzen, and I am the developer of Skald Against the Black Priory. It's a old school computer RPG that I signed with Raw Fury in about 6 months ago. So and this is my first visit to Stockholm. So because of COVID, we haven't been able to meet up. So I'm super happy to be down here and meet all the wonderful people at Raw Fury and have some FaceTime with Jonas and with you, Garnet. And
Thank you. Yeah. You made it up here to the Magic Attic.
I did. I don't know if that's a good thing, but I'm here.
It's a good thing. It's a very good thing.
Yeah, I guess.
And this man needs no introduction, but yet we still give it to him.
Well, I'm Jonas Antonsson. I'm first and foremost just a fan of Skald, and then also I'm the founder of Raw Fury, and which mostly means that I try not to get in the way of people that actually make the cool shit happen. I'm somewhat successful at it, but then you rope me into stuff like this, so
You actually are more like you're like the guy laying the cobblestone road out in front of developers like Anders, right? Because here's a guy who's by himself trying to go be like the renaissance of classic computer role-playing game. And that's a lot to take on. How do you come about like building? What's it like being a solo developer trying to build a large-scale, canonical, like old-school role-playing game?
Well, first of all, it's a lot of work. so it's been a huge deal to be able to sign with Raw Fury because it means that I can offload a lot more of the sort of managerial stuff onto them and focus more on the nerdy bits that are. As you say, like maybe like building the canon for the game and also making the game itself. I would say at least like it's a lot of work, but it's also the bread and butter of a good role playing game. I think because it's not really so much about making one game. I think it's about making an IP that is interesting to people to engage with. If it's just a game that people will play for 30 minutes and then they will walk away once they sort of finish the first chapter of the game, that's a lot less interesting than if the game becomes conversational and if it's something that people end up sort of nerding out over. And that's definitely what we're aiming for with Skald, to make like not just this game but a franchise that includes like a big and interesting canon that people can dig into, I guess. So
I'm interested in a few things. One that I'd love to hear you talk about is kind of the outside of what I would probably assume is our common love for old school RPGs and like systematic RPGs, both tabletop, later computer games, fantasy in novel form, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But like when you started making Skald, like what are the biggest influences on Skald, and like what are not just the mechanics, but also kind of what feeling are you trying to kind of recreate or reimagine?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think a lot of what motivated me to make Skald was to try and make a role-playing game that is subtly different, even though it is definitely a fantasy role-playing game, and sort of being able to dig into and find those places where it differs a little bit is very key to the experience. And I think a lot of people playing the game are sort of picking up on this without really being able to identify exactly what that difference is. And so for me, I try to like the Skald setting is definitely more inspired maybe by historical fantasy more so than like fantastic fantasy. It's a very low fantasy setting, and I'm a big history fan, so I'm very it's a big deal for me to have the world be sort of internally consistent. Like how would magic work in this? How would it affect the world? How would it affect the political system of the world? And sort of to build up this house of cards and then tip it a little bit and see it come tumbling over, and that's sort of where the interesting gameplay comes for the game. So that's a big pillar. And the other thing that's really important for me is to have to sort of try and explore some of the trope spaces in fantasy that are not super typical. So this isn't really a game where I try to avoid, like, there are no orcs and goblins in this game. It's like we try to stay very clearly away from things like fantasy that is very clearly derived from Judeo-Christian lore. So we lean more into the cosmic horror side of fantasy, and I think we try to do that. A lot of fantasy games that do cosmic horror, they have a very standard fantasy world, or they have a very standard gothic world, for instance, and then they sprinkle the cosmic horror on top of it. Probably because some boardroom exec said that, oh well, we should add some Lovecraft to this game because it sells better. But that's not really what we're trying to do with this game. I really want that to be kind of like the integral part of the game. And so like one of the key themes of the world is that it is a very clearly developed world in a lot of senses, and then it's sort of a question of trying to inject like a sense of wrongness to the world, that there is like this creeping malaise in the world, that there is something very, very wrong with the world, but it's very difficult to put the finger on. And that's definitely part of the challenge narratively, because if you're too explicit about cosmic horror, I think it ceases very quickly to be cosmic horror. And at the same time, since it's a game, you also you need things to punch, for instance. You need monsters in the game. So it's kind of like trying to marry these two things together. That is sort of the challenge of making the game, but it's also what's so rewarding about it. And I think hopefully we're doing a good job so far, and I'm very optimistic that it will.
Well, I love your point about like low fantasy, because I would argue one of the, well, there are several reasons that we can go into if we want to, but it's probably another show or a podcast. But I would argue one of the pillars of what makes Game of Thrones, for example, so compelling, is that it is essentially a very low fantasy setting.
Absolutely.
There's no
Hold the phone.
What?
Zombie ice dragons. That
Right.
is not low fantasy, my friend.
If you read the first 3 books.
Are you in the book fiction or are you in the movie?
I'm in the book fiction.
Okay.
I'm in the book
Okay,
fiction.
then never mind.
And if you
Sorry,
read the first
I
books-
would withdraw my zombie ice
All
dragons.
right, cool. But if you because if you read the first 3 books, there is some level of magic or spiritualism and like fantastical events that occur, right? Miracles or whatever. But that's not the focus of the story.
No, exactly.
The focus of the story is very much low fantasy would be a great way to kind of describe it. One of my favorite fantasy books of all time was actually written by Stephen King. It's called The Eyes of the Dragon.
Okay.
And it's like all Stephen King books, it ties into the same world of that's introduced in his canon, which is the Dark Tower. And there's a wizard in this book, but he isn't really like a wizard like we've always been or seen them portrayed in fantasy. And his name it's Randall Flagg. It's the same. It's the man in black.
The man in black.
Of course.
But there's a section in the book that is a spell casting section where he's making himself invisible, but he's not. What he's basically doing is he's manipulating people's perception of who is there or who is not. He never goes invisible.
Yeah.
He is just he's able to manipulate your perception towards feeling that he is more interesting and I am in the background, so you don't notice me. And that sort of kind of low magical
literary
fantasy
depth of
system. I thought it was absolutely brilliant at the time. And this is actually one of the things that when I saw the demo and the build that you originally sent us, I got pulled in by this because I thought it was so well done of how you're crafting exactly this, a coherent world that isn't reliant on so many of the tropes that are very much a fixture of RPGs, both games, literature, and tabletop RPGs. And I thought that was a very refreshing kind of take on making a game that is essentially also a very much a callback to like old school
Yeah.
RPGs.
Absolutely.
But this was one of the layers I thought was very interesting of like how you're actually kind of modernizing, even though it is and feels and in many ways plays like an old school RPG.
Yeah.
There's also a way of modernization there that
Yeah.
I particularly liked, and that was a kind of a breath of fresh air for me.
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm going with this.
No, no, no. I
No,
know,
but
but
I don't know. Am I almost getting some sense of irony here, though? Because you're really enjoying the old schoolness of it, which in itself are the old things that laid down the patterns for those tropes.
Yeah.
But you're then saying, I don't want the tropes. It's sort of an interesting question for you, Anders. Like, how do you decide what to take from the old? Like, how much does the audience need to have something that's like, oh, but I'd really love this part where I have
Yeah, exactly.
I have to have a fireball. Well, why do you have to have a fireball? But every game has a fireball.
Yeah, I think that first of all, I think that the game is definitely sort of self-commentary in that way, and that's well observed, because that's not it's not by chance. It's sort of by design that it sort of tries to comment a little bit on that a little bit. But I think that what you're asking about, Garnet, is I think for especially games more so than any fantasy medium. I think that a lot of the sort of a lot of the fixtures that we expect there, they're there because the designers put them there because they're so easy to put in.
Yes.
For instance, because you don't want, it's difficult to make a game where you kill thousands of humans, for instance. Just like from like a legal perspective, why wouldn't the world react if you're killing all these humans all the time? So let's put orcs in, let's paint them green and make them barbaric instead. So, and I think that that's not necessarily something the community or like the fans really hunger for. They just want a good story and a compelling setting. It doesn't matter if there's orcs in it or not. And that's been sort of one of the big aha experiences. And working with the game, for sure, I can see that there are a lot of things that are sort of pulling at you as a designer. So, let's just put orcs in here, because let's put goblins in, because you can't go around killing kids. But you need something that's small and easy to punch, easier than a big human to punch, you know. So let's put goblins in there. No, but like, but probably there is a way around that. And
At some point, are you not just making analogs for orcs, though?
well, there's nothing wrong with making analogs for orcs, because orcs are analogs for other things already. So
yeah, we're sort of folding on top of ourselves. aren't
yeah, I think so. I think like, and I think this is more of a discussion sort of kind of like, I would say, like the ethics of fantasy writing, where a lot of, for instance, orcs are basically stand-in for primitive, not primitive human culture, but non-Western human cultures.
Well, exactly. And there are very, very easy way to represent the other.
Absolutely.
Right? Something that is very juxtaposed from our thoughts about like morality or of good or of what is righteous and right.
Yeah.
So they are like they're a very easy way to be an analog for the other. For the enemy.
Yeah.
And I think that you touch upon such a good point, because if you take away that sort of analog and now you're warring against other humans, it becomes harder. It becomes harder to explain, like the what is the moral difference? Like what are your actions? Why are they good? Why are they righteous? Maybe you're on the side of evil. Maybe like it all becomes more gray.
It does.
And I think actually, and this is why I like the kind of the modernization in many ways, because I think that we've seen in modern fantasies, and I'll come back to like Game of Thrones does this very well, where the political intrigue and the fight between the different factions and the different nations creates kind of a much grayer area in terms of who is actually the good guy, who is actually the bad guy, who is what nation is in the right, what nation is in the wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that in many ways this is what when I'm looking at something like Skald, it's tickling like two itches at the same time. It's a throwback for me, very nostalgic throwback for me to games like Ultima, to like so and that throwback is very welcome. But at the same time, there is this level of modernization which I think we as and then I'm going to use kind of the royal we of people that like fantasy and like role-playing games in general, that this this has been kind of the journey of the storytelling aspect, the narrative aspect.
Absolutely.
And marrying those two components, I think, it's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think it's this has been kind of the moment I sort of decided to go with this project. It's been a pretty charmed project from the start, because I also realized very quickly that sort of marrying a modern narrative of kind of psychological fantasy to something that is, in my eyes, like a very beautiful expression of computer role-playing games. It's like highly pixelated, low fidelity. That was like it hadn't really been done before, and there might be examples out there that I'm not really familiar with, but like I really wanted to play that game myself, and when I realized that there wasn't really any good offerings, I rushed to fill that niche, and I'm very happy I did so.
So, so this is good, because you really identified what your high level concept and aspiration was.
Absolutely.
But now back to you being one person. There's a lot to fill in here, my friend.
Yeah.
There are characters, there's worlds, there's
Yeah.
environments, there are all those enemies.
Yeah.
How do you tackle all of that as one person?
I think that doing world building for a project like this, I think one of the mistakes a lot of people do is that they get bogged down in minutia too soon. And what happens is that once you do that, you kind of create constraints for yourself that are maybe not helpful.
Okay.
And which may also sort of put the emphasis on parts of the setting that doesn't, like, it might have been interesting for you as you wrote it, but it might not be the most interesting part or the most important part of the setting. And so for me, it's sort of been a question of doing it like in a very tiered thing, where I try to think about like the big metaphysical things first, and then that puts some constraints, but there's still a lot that can go down on inside those, and sort of trying to think about it more in terms of systems, and how, like, okay, this is a very gross component in the game, like this is sort of the imperial monopoly on the use of magic. How does that affect sort of the lay nobility of the empire? I don't need to know the name of every noble house. That's not important. A lot of people would do that. They would spend time doing that, but that's not important.
And would relish it, actually. Would relish that
it's
activity.
Super fun.
Yeah.
It's super fun, but it's also a fantastic way to make sure you never finish the project.
Yes, you'd get sucked into that
Yeah,
very quickly.
absolutely. It will block everything off, and also it can very quickly become one of those things where, because I know for myself that I think it's very hard to kill my own babies creatively. So I might like write up this really cool like history of some noble house or some knightly order, and then you start thinking, are there even knights in this world? Like, is errantry a thing? Is there like a feudal system? And you start thinking, oh no, but I can't put that out because I have this knightly order that I really love, and so and it becomes and then it becomes less constructive. So for me, it's, I'm a huge Dune fan. I'm wearing a Dune shirt right now, and I think like the way Frank Herbert builds his world has been like, Dune is a huge influence on Skald, and I think everyone who's a Dune fan will see it when they play the game, because he was also very much sort of in the sociological fantasy approach, where he was more interested in sort of seeing the big pictures and systems, ecologies at work. So, which is interesting because it's also a book about ecology, but his world building is also very ecological. So that's something that I try to. Basically, that's my approach to sort of doing the canon. So, yeah.
So I'm getting a sense of almost like, excuse me while I date myself, but like old school Gary Gygax, like Wielding World of Greyhawk. Here's this map and these areas and these places. Go forth, young module creator, and figure out what the hell to do in them.
I think, honestly, I read, like, me and Jonas were talking about it before we started, but I read a lot of RPG books. I collect and read them. I don't have time to play computer RPGs, but I read them. And if there's one thing, like, especially first and second edition of D&D did so well, it was that they created interesting locations that weren't so explicitly gamified as they are later. Now it's so, in 3rd, 4th, 5th edition, like everything it's so explicitly gamified that you can just see the writing room going on. Okay, we need 5 adventure hooks here, we need 5 adventure hooks here. But in the old books, they were basically doing more of an organic thing, where they would just like write interesting things, and reading it would trigger things in your head.
And also relying on the dungeon master
Yep.
to be that game master.
100%, not being spoon-fed it, and instead sort of
Yeah.
having
So I mean,
this...
I DM'd for a long time. Pardon my rude interjection, but I DM'd for a long time, and like one of the most fun things I ever did was making ultimate weapons, because we called them carded weapons. Yeah, everyone had they were on note cards, right?
Yeah.
But the best part of making note cards was there was always the stinger. Always the stinger. It's like, the +5 Vorpal sword of, oh, your charisma is 12.
Yeah, yeah.
As long as you're wielding it. Or if you use this shield within the last 3 days, your healing potions are reduced by half.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it was great, because you were creating this fantasy on the fly that no one writer could ever create those hooks, right? They would create those hooks, but then everyone would encounter those hooks.
Yeah.
Whereas what the world building system was doing was creating a space in which creative people would then make things that happened in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I don't know what my point was out of that. Other than
No, but I
you
think
took me
you're
there.
absolutely onto something. Did you play tabletop role-playing games?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Were you a game master or a player?
Game Master, that was the other one, yeah.
Yeah, I've been both.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, usually I enjoyed more being the player, because I also discovered my joy of being a sort of player that messed with the game master
Yeah,
as much as possible.
I
Oh,
can,
you were that person.
Yes.
Oh, hi.
yeah, I can absolutely see you being that guy.
Well, you know what? That's okay. I had an answer for him. It was 2d10. Because anytime you came up with that crazy crap, I was just like, okay, here's 2d10. You have a chance. I'm not telling you what it is.
Yeah.
Nope, didn't get it.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, I mean, back when I was a teenager and was playing, your reliance on a good DM was like having a good DM was everything.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it was such an important role to the actual experience.
Yes, it was.
And so basically you could make or break a group of people playing together just based on the character and the narrative prowess and the genuinity of the person that was playing the DM.
And the
Absolutely.
stupid reality of day to day. If your DM had a bad day the weekend, the day before, you're playing Friday night, if they had a bad day at work, dude, your adventure that night is screwed.
Yep.
You're like, what the hell is happening? Why is this happening? I had a bad day today.
I'll also say, still in my memory, some of the most interesting, fun arguments I've ever had was playing, we played a lot of different stuff. We played, AD&D, obviously.
Yeah.
We played Cyberpunk a bunch.
I never
There was a
played
game
that,
called
yeah.
Toons, which was very interesting.
wow.
Okay.
Then GURPS we played.
Yeah.
And
I heard
Vampire
GURPS
the
forever.
Masquerade when that came out. And some of the most interesting arguments that I've had in my life was while playing some of these tabletop RPGs. And you realized at some point that you were you were having a shouting match with 3 or 4 or 5 other people over something that was completely made up and at no
No bearing on the real
Yes,
world.
exactly. And you were having this deep serious argument about
Yeah.
why something was like this and not that, and it was
Yeah,
fantastic.
you're like in the middle of a barroom brawl, and then the player character goes, "Wait, is there a cask of beer in the bar?" And the DM goes, "Yes." Are there any dwarves in the bar? Oh shit, I see where this is going. I levitate the back cask of beer over to the dwarves and I open it up right in front of them.
Yeah, exactly.
But that was the beauty of that. So, and now I'm going to bring it back to you, this is really difficult as a game developer. All of this stuff, because you wanted to embody all this great classic machinery, how do you do it in a game?
I think we know a lot more about game development now than we did when. And
That's a great point.
don't get me wrong. The games that I'm sort of emulating, they are fantastic games. But it's easy to be a game developer these days compared to then, because basically I can do this myself, because you have both technical tools and also there's a lot of literature on how to make good games and how to. And I'm a big fan of sort of and obviously it's a combination of being analytical and sort of identifying game loops and also kind of going with your gut and just expressing yourself. But I think in a role-playing game, I think that what's core to the experience is sort of player choice And I think that what we tend to forget a lot is choice and sort of player expression through choice. And what we tend to forget a lot is that it takes less than we think to give the player a good experience of being in control. It doesn't have to be super complicated all the time. It can be as simple as a dialogue tree. But the dialogue options need to have some bearing on the story. If you choose A or B, it can't all come to the same to the same conclusion. And so I think that's basically what I always try to think about in my game design. It's like, is this an interesting decision? Is there a decision point here? Is this? It doesn't have to be super interesting, but the player will choose A or they will choose B, and then they will see an outcome. And even if it's a small outcome, they will still think, "Yeah, that's something I did. I did that. I chose to draw my bow instead of my sword. Or I chose to answer this instead of that." And just like smatter that all over the game. That is sort of at the core of a good role-playing game experience, because it gives a player so much room to express themselves, even like in the small minor things, to role-play basically.
That's what we want to do.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Why. That's actually what we're there for.
Absolutely. And you know, in computer role-playing games, you can't do, especially with sort of a relatively small budget, there is a limit to. Like an interesting case study is Baldur's Gate 3, where they're basically trying to make
You're literally reading my mind.
Yeah.
Because I was going to talk about Divinity 2 and Baldur's Gate 3.
Exactly, where sort of the idea is obviously to make a world that is so malleable that you can do everything. It's going to be the tabletop experience, but it's not going to, though, is it?
You don't think? So tell me. I don't know.
I don't know, because it isn't a tabletop RPG. It is a computer RPG. Can it be a tabletop RPG? Can you write the book that is a movie? I don't think so.
Well,
I think you can make a really good CRPG, no doubt about it. Larian Studio, they are brilliant people. Sven Vinke backed. He's a huge backer of Skald on Kickstarter. So shout out to you, Sven. You're obviously watching this. But
Hello, Sven.
but
no pressure.
I don't know. I don't know if you can emulate the tabletop experience, and I don't think you should either, because it isn't a tabletop.
Well, I mean, you brought up the book movie thing, right? You can adapt. You can adapt one
absolutely
one representation in an artistic medium to another representation in another artistic medium, but you'll never replace. And I think that
exactly.
Coming back to like one of the most successful TV series in modern history, obviously, is Game of Thrones. But and I enjoyed the series outside of maybe the last season, but overall I think it was a well produced, fun series to watch. But it's a very different experience in my view from reading the books. I think those two are you want, like, yes, you understand you are in the same world and you are with the same characters in a way. Yeah. But the feeling from the two are, at least for me, were vastly different.
Absolutely.
And the impact of reading the books was way more than watching the show.
And I think that's sort of one of the keys in sort of trying to adapt the tabletop RPG to a computer is exactly what you were describing, and you were describing earlier, is that so much of the fun of a tabletop RPG is the interaction with the other people around the table. It's not the interaction with the rule mechanics. The rule mechanics are of no consequence when you're playing a tabletop RPG. We could play a ruleless tabletop RPG right now and have a lot of fun if we had the
the right GM.
Yeah,
exactly. With the right game master, you're in great shape.
Exactly.
One of the best modern tabletop RPGs is a game called Fiasco.
Yeah,
and it's more or less a rule. Like there are
rules.
There are scenarios that you're given.
Yeah,
and then it becomes up to the group and the DM and the fantasy of the players what actually happens, and it's a fucking amazing experience.
To your Game of Thrones reference, I think that this is one of the traps that video falls into. So Game of Thrones is a fascinating chronicle for me because early on it's trying to adhere too closely to the books. Right, and you're sort of stuck in like, are we developing characters, and you're getting pulled in, and then in the middle, I think it hits its stride really well as a on the video screen sort of dramatic interpretation, and at the end it becomes Attack of the Clones. Here's some special effects and oh my god and magic, because it just becomes all caught up in it's like here's the grandeur and amazingness of magic, and it ruins the imaginative nature of it, and it ruins the characters.
And I think this is again back to what is being put into the show because of laziness from the designer side, not because the fans want it, but because it's really easy to put dragons and more explosions and
Well, yeah,
big
of course.
battles
and Jar Jar Binks.
Yeah, exactly. And
Was
writing
he there?
All is well
Wasn't
then.
he? No, so I think
Do you have
yeah,
your Jar Jar Binks?
in my game.
Yes.
No, not really. I have no, I don't really have like a big comic relief character.
Or your
in the game.
C-3PO, because I guess, we all know the bullshit line about, well, Jar Jar Binks was my C-3PO. Oh, really? That's a great...
No.
Deflect!
Yeah, that was not the case. But no, I don't really have a Jar Jar Binks character in the game. There is always like humor in horror and in fiction that tries to take itself serious is difficult because you don't want to come off as taking yourself too seriously.
Yes.
But putting too much humor in, it can very quickly verge on being immersion breaking because it can quickly be like fourth wall breaking things. So that's a really complicated tightrope to walk. But I think like the humor in the game is more, it's more from inside the game itself. We don't really try to have it be explicitly
humor, super difficult.
Yeah, it is difficult. It is
difficult
difficult.
games. Difficult games, difficult even for someone like Dave Chappelle even to navigate it these days. Because where people's perceptions are of what's funny anymore and what's acceptable, it's really hard to know that. And when you're in a static medium, whether it be text messages or online social media or a video game, super difficult.
I think what we're maybe aiming more for, which I think is a good call in media like this, is more charm than humor. If you understand what.
That's a great way to go.
Yeah.